tonight. Very special conversation. I've done a lot of these, and this is pretty exciting. I'm Greg Dalton. In 2007, I went to the Arctic on a global warming expedition with scientists and journalists aboard an icebreaker. Experiencing climate change at the top of the world changed my life, and when I returned, I created Climate One as a project of the Commonwealth Club. For the last 12 years, I've been interviewing leaders about how burning fossil fuels disrupts all of the systems around us, our food system, our water system, our ecosystems, our lifestyle, and our economy. Climate changes everything. My guest today is Tom Steyer. In 2012, he left the hedge fund company he founded to become a full-time organizer for political and climate action. With a billion-dollar fortune, he flirted with running for governor of California and president of the United States. In January 2019, he told reporters in Iowa that he would not run for president and instead would devote 100% of his time and resources to impeaching Donald Trump and removing him from office. Then in July, he changed his mind and jumped into the crowded field. He's poised to qualify for the next debate in September. Please welcome Tom Steyer back to the Climate One stage. Tom, welcome back. One question. Why? Why are you running?
Well, as my family that are sitting in the front row know, I really couldn't sleep because I was listening to the debates and I was very worried that we were going to have a fulsome and important discussion about policy differences, about healthcare and the Green New Deal and education and immigration, but that in fact, we weren't talking about whether any of the policies that were being proposed were possible to actually enact, that we weren't talking in the real world about what we could do and how we could do it. We were talking about policies that if we had control, what we'd want. And to me, the real question at this point in the United States is, what can we actually get done? We have a broken government. What can we do to unbreak it? And what can we do particularly about climate, to act in real time for an urgent problem that doesn't demand a nice policy solution, but demands action immediately?
And you say on day one, you would declare a climate emergency. What does that mean, and why do you think that's necessary?
If you're following the science on climate, then you know that we have to act immediately. What it means to declare a state of emergency is to activate the emergency powers of the president, of which there are about 150. And I would say that includes the ability to set regulations about things like building codes and EVs. It allows you to move money around. I would give the Congress 100 days, which is a little more than 3 months, to pass something like the Green New Deal, but they've had 28 years to pass something like the Green New Deal. And actually, we don't have the luxury of waiting any longer. If you're actually looking at the science, we don't. But more than that, if you think about actually dealing with climate in the real world, it's a global problem. If we do a perfect job in the United States on January 21st, 2021, the day the new president is sworn in, it's not nearly enough. You know, if you look at what we have to do, we have to lead a coalition of countries around the world to solve this problem. And the question is, why would they ever listen to the United States of America unless we've got our house in order? So, if you're talking in the real world, the three things I've said are, you have to start on day one urgently. It's an emergency, treat it like an emergency. 2, it's got to be people-based. Every single thing that I've learned over the last 10 years about running propositions and getting votes, about coming up with fair policies, about putting together any kind of responsible democratic coalition involves being a grassroots-oriented movement. And so if you're not doing that, in my mind, you're going to have the wrong policy, and you're not going to win. And the third thing is, if you aren't real about getting the rest of the world to come along, then you're not real. And so if you're just talking about the United States and policies that you hope to get voted in at some point in the future, I don't think that's nearly enough, to be honest, Greg.
You talk about pragmatism, what can get done, and the Green New Deal. Some people, even on the left, have criticized the Green New Deal for being fuzzy, overly ambitious. And so is the Green Deal, first of all, it's a resolution. It's aspirational. It's not a bill. There are not our specifics there. Do you think you can get something that big through that fast?
So I don't know how many of the people in the audience or the people listening have actually read the Green New Deal proposal. It's about 5 pages. It's very broad, and I think that's absolutely appropriate. If you're talking about rebuilding and changing the economy, then you have to understand it's not a siloed policy issue. It's something that goes across issues and that touches many different parts of the economy in the country. And I think the Green New Deal fits the answer to the scope of the problem. I think is very responsible in the way that it thinks that it addresses this problem broadly, and I'm a big fan of it. It is just a proposal and a guideline, but I think that it got a lot of attention in a very good way, and it was vilified by the right-wing press, the Fox Newses of the world, the Breitbarts, that exaggerated what it was to try and make it seem like something that it isn't. It's actually a very responsible and thoughtful document that I think pushed this debate forward in many ways. I'm a big fan.
And one thing that the Green New Deal that other green plans didn't do is it addressed some issues of capitalism, wealth distribution, jobs, et cetera. Do you really think that is at the root of it? Because some people would say, hey, climate's so big and serious and urgent, let's tackle that and we'll get to some of those other things later because we can't do it all at once. Our nation can only absorb so much change at once, which is one thing that Barney Frank said, progressive member of Congress, former member of Congress from Massachusetts. So can you address capitalism and climate at the same time?
Well, I think that if you're talking about rebuilding the United States, you're going to have to put that, in our plan, it's $2 trillion of government money over 10 years, plus a bunch of regulations and rules like building codes, like EV requirements, like the renewable portfolio standards. So changing the way we do business broadly in this country so that the $2 trillion of expenditure by the government will be dwarfed by how much the private sector spends. So if you're going to do that, you're going to rebuild this country, I think it's important to reflect on how that's going to be done in a fair way and in a way that will make us richer, better employed, grow faster, be healthier. As a business person, I can tell you, the common response of people who are trying to deny climate and prevent progress is to say we have a choice between a healthy economy and a healthy environment. And that is an absolute lie. That's a false choice. We are going to have a healthier economy and a healthier environment. And we proved that years ago and talked about it here.
Right. Even if there was no climate change, a lot of the solutions would still be better for us in a lot of ways.
One of the things people may know or may not know, sorry to interrupt, Greg.
Go ahead.
If you look at the cost of renewables versus the cost of fossil fuels on a per kilowatt hour basis, renewables are cheaper than fossil fuels and will continue to get cheaper. So when people talk about, it's going to be bad for the economy because the cost of energy will be higher, that's the opposite is true. We can create lower cost energy without even talking about the health costs of old-fashioned pollution from coal or the climate costs of the pollution of putting CO2 in the atmosphere.
There was a mind-bending report recently by Bloomberg that said that oil would have to get to $20 a barrel to compete with renewables, right? Oil's never been to 20, it's been down. So, but to be clear, you're talking about a government-led transformation. You're a capitalist who made a fortune in markets. I want to understand, this is government leading and markets following, because a lot of the debate in Washington, of course, is whether and even in California,
right,
market-based is better rather than government mandate and dictate.
So let's talk about that for a second, because that's a great point, Greg. There is this fear that somehow governments are going to control markets. Well, let's get into the real world. Governments have always controlled markets. There is no such thing as a free market in nature. In fact, there are always rules in every market that are set by somebody. So let me give you an example. 100 years ago, you could have hired a 14-year-old child to work for 14 hours and paid him or her a quarter. totally legal. That was the labor market that was controlled by the government of California in the United States. Today, that's not legal. Somebody said that's not legal. You know, at the same time, in California, it used to be that you could drive a car that did not have a catalytic converter. That was legal. That was the market. God did not come down and say we need catalytic converters. In fact, human beings decided we need to breathe air that didn't kill us. So the idea of a free market, unregulated by human beings and by governments, is a myth. Every market has rules back to the earliest markets pre-industrial revolution. When do you set up the market? Who gets to put their stall where? Everything has rules. So the government has always set the rules. And it's appropriate that it should be true because the rules of the market determine the outcomes. In fact, government, as the representative of the will of the people, should be setting the rules for the outcomes for the people, and the corporation should be figuring out how to work within those rules. That's entirely appropriate. That's what we're talking about doing, and it has nothing to do with capitalism or not capitalism. It has to do with the rules of society should be set by the people in society, not the corporations.
Today, and a big thing of your campaign, Tom Steyer, is taking back the power of the corporations. Corporations have taken over government. Just today, the Business Roundtable, some of the largest corporations in the country, took what could be a significant move, and they said that their values, their goal is not just to maximize shareholder value, that it is to have other things. What do you make of that? Is that just spin and PR, or do you see that there's actually some kind of recognition in corporate America that shareholder maximization is problematic?
So I think in order to evaluate that statement, let's go back a little bit in history, which is prior to the 1980s, it was in the law of the United States that CEOs, the people who run companies, and the directors who supervise the running of companies could have different constituents. They could have the shareholders, they could have their employees as a legitimate cause for concern. They could have the communities that they worked in and could think that having a healthy community was part of their charge. In the 1980s, in Delaware, where most of the big corporations in America are located legally, they changed the law. And that they said the responsibility of a CEO and of directors of a corporation is solely the shareholders and profits. And that it was no longer legal for them to do things at the expense of shareholders and profits. So when we think about where we are today, and you hear some of the biggest corporations, which are all headquartered in Delaware, changing that, I say, show me. Because in fact, what we've seen since the 1980s is an overwhelming, absolute pursuit of profits at the expense of everything else. That, the kind of things that Cat Taylor does with B corporations and having different bottom lines with an awareness of communities and employees and the world is very, very rare. And in fact, we've seen corporations not just run their businesses that way, but try to change the laws of society on their behalf so that they could take advantage of working people, so that they could pollute more, so that they would, basically take advantage of the communities where they live. So if I understand that fancy, well-known, well-respected business people do not want to seem like rapacious and evil people, and they're saying that, but I want to see some action because, frankly, we've seen the exact opposite for decades, and we're suffering from it. And there's been, I can show you thousands of examples of the opposite. I want someone to show me corporations acting, and I don't say this angrily. I just say, that's why I want democracy. I want the people's representatives to be representing the people, and corporations are perfectly free to pursue their own interest within the laws set up by the people. That doesn't upset me. I'm not looking for them to save us. Larry, I am not looking for corporations to save us. I'm not. If they do good work, I'm happy to applaud it. But their job is to work and do their job, and I think we need to save ourselves, and that's why we need to take back the democracy.
Willie Brown, a legendary California Democratic politician, wrote of his fellow Democrats just a few days ago after Tom Steyer jumped in the race, quote, "Almost no one has faith in any of the 20-plus candidates now running. Trump voters don't expect him to find them a job. They don't expect free health care. They don't have college debt. Trump voters know they are screwed. They just want to be entertained." Tom Steyer, your response to Democratic sage
first of all,
Willie Brown.
Willie Brown is one of the smartest and most entertaining people that any of us will ever meet. So you have to take him seriously because he's super smart. What I would say about Trump voters is this. They believe what I believe, which is the government has been purchased by corporations. They believe that the government is not out to serve them, and they're very angry about it. And that's a big reason that they voted for Mr. Trump, is they believe that the government was disrespecting and disregarding them. And I think 80% of Americans, Democrats, Republicans, and independents, think corporations have bought the government. And so when Trump voters are angry about that, I think they share that across the board. They had a solution that I consider to be completely toxic, which was Mr. Trump. But the problem that they believed existed, and that's what Mr. Trump ran on, was the system's broken, they hate you, and I'm here to break the system again and get back to you. That is something that Americans across the board believe. The problem was he was lying. And in fact, he's done everything he can to help he's the biggest aid to corporations at the expense of the American people that has ever existed in our history.
This is Climate One. I'm Greg Dalton. My guest is Tom Steyer, businessman and activist running for the Democratic presidential nomination. Up next, what he thinks about immigration when Climate One continues. This will be a radio break. Those of you in the room, if you have question cards, please pass them to the aisles and my colleagues will pick them up. And later, a handful of people will be called to the microphone to ask your question. My guest on Climate One is Tom Steyer, Democratic candidate for president. We're talking about his plan to declare a climate emergency and where he stands on other issues. Tom, you want to declare a climate crisis. The president says there's a crisis at the border. What are you going to do about immigration and the border?
Look, I think immigration is a number of issues that are being pushed together. The first thing to talk about in terms of immigration is the 11 to 13 million people who are living in the United States, who've been living in the United States, who are begging for comprehensive immigration reform, who are looking for a path to citizenship. And the fact that our government hasn't been able to do that for decades is one of the proofs that this government is broken and can't do the basic job that's required of them. I think the second question in looking at immigration is the people who are fleeing from Central America and coming to the United States for asylum, and we have a president and an administration that has dealt with them criminally from the standpoint of international law, inhumanely from any human standpoint that I would recognize, and in an absolutely un-American way that we should be ashamed of. When we see our administration separating children from their parents, which is effectively torture, keeping people in detention centers for years with inadequate controls, and basically doing everything they can to terrorize people. So that's the second thing, is how are we going to actually give a response, a humane and legal response to the people who are coming here for asylum? Then the third question is, what about immigration itself? America has been built by people coming here as immigrants. This is part of our formula for success over centuries. The idea that suddenly we're vilifying poor people who are coming here to find a better life as somehow taking things from the pockets of existing American citizens seems to me to be crazy. So yes, this is our country and we have a right to set the rules, but let's recognize that immigration is a series of things and that we need immigrants, that in fact they're a huge benefit to us. We get to set the rules, but let's set these rules clearly and give them a path to citizenship at the same time that we control the border.
Montana Governor Steve Bullock is one Democratic candidate who has an intriguing story. He was reelected in a state Donald Trump won by 20 points, and he worked with the Republican legislature to add really what is a progressive agenda: expand Medicaid, constrain healthcare costs, and restrict corporate money in politics. A governor with that kind of record harkens back to the surprising surges of Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton. But Steve Bullock said on MSNBC recently that the Democratic rules are preventing such underdogs from getting on the debate stage this time.
I think the DNC rules were well-intentioned, but what it really has done is allowed like a billionaire to buy a spot on the debate stage. Tom Steyer just spent $10 million to get 130,000 donors. We're getting to the point where we're spending money online as opposed to actually talking to voters. The Republican Party, all throughout the year before, 2015, had a 1% threshold. It's a rough day when Democrats are less inclusive than Republicans.
Montana Governor Steve Bullock. Tom Steyer, your response about the rules this time are kind of squeezing out the lesser-known Jimmy Carters, Bill Clintons, who don't have the money to run a national campaign and spend $70 to get $1 donation.
Look, I think there's a very simple challenge for everybody who wants to be the Democratic nominee, and that's to have something to say that people want to hear. And I think it's very simple. I think that if I'm saying something that touches people and they believe that I'm a credible messenger, then they'll respond. And if they don't, they absolutely won't. And I think that's true of every single person. So from my standpoint, there is a real question with 24 people about getting heard. But in my mind, there's a real question of what are you saying that's different? What are you saying that's meaningful? And why would anybody trust you to actually carry out what you're talking about? I think that's true for me. I think that's true for Governor Bullock. I think that's true for everybody in the race. And I think it's a real question. I think that when I look at the people running, I am the person who spent 10 years as an outsider organizing coalitions of American citizens to take on corporate interests and to register voters, engage voters, and turn them out at the polls. And so I think that I'm very different from all the other people in the race, but particularly all the people who are Washington insiders. So I think when I think about what is my appeal, why would people listen to me, I have 10 years of proving it. I have 10 years of beating corporations at the ballot box, of pushing successful change, and of also recreating democracy across the United States.
The party is moving left, a more diverse candidate pool than ever. How do you think about this as a moment for a wealthy white man?
I really think that the question here is message and credibility. I believe really strongly that if you're going to understand what people feel and their circumstances and where they're coming from, you have got to actually gone out and look them in the eye. It's funny, Kat and I started a program to provide farm to table in public schools in California. And we went down to a city south of San Diego, San Isidro, to see kids eat lunch, eat fish tacos on a sunny day south of San Diego. If you see an 8-year-old kid in a California sun with a big smile eat a fish taco, you have a different opinion about what it means to provide farm to table in the public schools. You want to understand what the ACA means, the Affordable Care Act? Talk to somebody who tells you, if they get rid of the ACA, I will die, I cannot afford medical care. If you want to understand what it means not to have clean water to drink, go to a place where the state government will not allow your African American community to get a water treatment facility and your husband is dying of a failing kidney. So if you ask me about how do you qualify as being able to represent Americans, my answer is you better have spent years going and talking to people and understanding who they are and where they're coming from. And you better get it from the neck down. Because if you're getting it from the neck up and reading reports and looking at statistics, that's completely different from understanding on a human basis what people are going through. And I'll say one other thing. If you go around the United States of America, which I've done for 7 years, you will find out that people are fantastic. They're inspirational. They do things that are amazing. And you will never be disappointed. I mean, what I've seen in looking at people is that they're very brave, very compassionate, very informed. The American people put together are smarter than anybody. That's why I believe in democracy. If put together, we are smarter than anybody, and our answers are better than anybody's.
Communities of color have been disproportionately disadvantaged by the fossil fuel economy. Kamala Harris came out with her climate plan, very justice-centered. You have a big part of climate justice in your plan. How can people who've been living near factories and sources of pollution be included in this new green economy? Because sometimes there's concern they'll be left behind, they can't afford it. How can they be included in a just transition?
So, back in 2010, so 10 years ago, I was co-chairing the No on 23 campaign with George Shultz. And we were up against 2 oil companies. And 4 years before that, in 2006, somebody from Southern California spent $72 million fighting oil companies, lost all of his money, and lost the election. So it wasn't like there were a lot of people who wanted to take them on. Our coalition started in communities that had bad health. The communities that had a lot of asthma, the communities that had bad water. And if you look at California or the United States, the voters who care the most about climate, energy, pollution, the environment are Latinos. Number 2 group, African Americans. Number 3 group, Asian Americans. So when you're talking about a climate policy or an environmental policy or a pollution policy, those are not people who you include. Those are people you start with and who are going to lead on this. That's why I said, when I look at our climate plan, it isn't going to be the right policy if you don't start there, and you're not going to end up with the right coalition if you don't start there. And if you look at the reauthorization of cap and trade in California in 2017, so that was a year-long process. I think on January 2nd, we were talking about how to make it good for the communities that had the worst air and the worst water. And the answer was we took the cap and trade money and disproportionately sent it to those communities because they'd been suffering from the pollution that had been intentionally located in their communities for decades. And so when I think about this, Greg, I don't think about including them, I think about starting there. And one of the people who I think is the most thoughtful on this in the country is a woman named Vienne Trong, who's a friend and who's worked on our climate plan and who's been an essential part of thinking about how to do this.
Climate, and that's excellent example of a way to make climate very personal in a way that immigration and other issues are, because climate is thought to be not personal, far away, polar bears or melting ice. Climate is also, as you and I know, Tom, worse than most people accept or want to think about. And so politicians usually want to sell optimism and hopeful messages, but knowing, how bad is it and how do you talk about it?
Well, I don't think I'd be saying that I'm going to declare a state of emergency on the first day and use the emergency powers of the president and revive America's role in the world around climate if I didn't think it were an emergency. I think very clearly the safety and health of every American is at stake, and the safety and health of every American that ever will be. So when I talk about this, I believe that if we are not dealing with this immediately, that we are missing every single day, week, month, year that goes by, we increase our risk. And if you think about the president's job, number 1, the safety and health of the American people. That's number 1. And that's traditionally been thought of as the commander-in-chief, that we will not allow people to kill us. And we're killing ourselves. And to see this president encourage that process, speed it up. I mean, I am the person who started the Need to Impeach campaign. This guy has failed in his most... He has failed in his most basic job in the United States of America, which is to protect us. And I believe that unless you're willing to take the step that I'm talking about, I don't believe you're being realistic in what we have to do. I believe it can sound nice. I think that I would rejoin Paris on day one, but rejoining Paris doesn't get anything actually done. Having the Green New Deal itself, if it doesn't get passed, is just good policy. The question is, what are we going to do in the real world in time, and how are we going to engage the rest of the world to actually do something to make actual changes? And I'll give you an example. We have 237 coal plants left in the United States. We've shut down, I think, 291 over the last 5 or 10 years through the very good work of the Sierra Club, the Beyond Coal campaign, Michael Bloomberg. I give them all the credit in the world. There are 2,500 coal plants in the world. There are 1,000 on the docket to be built. If we close 237 coal plants on the day after the next inauguration, and they build 1,000 more that will last at least 40 years, do the math. It's easy. So the question is, look, China is intending to build 350 plants as part of their economic expansion, the so-called Belt and Road program that isn't in China, that's just in Southeast Asia and Africa. So unless we go to the rest of the world and partner with them and work with them and lead in the way that the United States has led in the past, including on values and morals, but also on technology and finance and commerce, then this isn't going to happen. So when I look at this, I see this as there is a path for us. It'll be good for us in all ways that I can see. But if we don't take the path, we are running a tremendous, tremendous, unacceptable risk that anybody who's going to take responsibility should not run.
China's paying for the Belt and Road. Are you saying that the U.S. should actually you mentioned finance, should the U.S. send capital? Those countries, if they had an affordable option to coal, they'd take it. They say like, hey, coal's the cheapest, we got it, it's in the ground, I need to provide energy for my people. Any politician, that's their responsibility. Would you fund some energy development?
Look, when I think about our relationships internationally, they're complicated. We are in a relationship with countries around the world, and it's not a simple thing. There aren't a lot of people who live their lives to help the United States of America. But we have traditional allies. We have people with whom we share deep values. We have people who we've worked together over decades or centuries who we can trust. And then we have people who are important partners of ours, but whom we may disagree with very profoundly. So the example I would use is Iran. We disagree with the government of Iran very deeply. But in coalition with some of our traditional allies, we made a deal with Iran to prevent, where they agreed not to develop nuclear weapons, and we gave them some things that they thought would be better for them. And it was complicated, and we didn't say we loved them, but we were willing to work in coalition with our allies to come out with something that was better for them and better for us, which Mr. Trump walked away from. And my point is, we need to have that kind of relationship around the world, knowing that people have different interests, but being a value-driven partner that people can trust and where we give them a better outcome than they otherwise would have in ways that are importantly good for us. Yeah, that's how we have to do it. The world, we're part of the world, whether we like it or not, and you cannot build a fence around the United States of America and think that all of a sudden all the problems are going to stay outside. That's ridiculous.
A big theme in your campaign has been, attacking corporations, the consolidation of corporate power, particularly corporate power over the political process. Other people have been looking at corporations recently, the lack of federal action on climate, saying, we're glad that corporate America wants to move on climate, to move toward clean energy, is pushing states to get wind and solar into red states. We're glad that the corporations are trying to work on deforestation. So how would you engage with corporations, and do you think that they can be positive actors in this move toward a cleaner economy?
So let me say this. I'm a capitalist. I spent 30 years as an investor around the world. I believe in the power of the private sector to get things done. I just believe that the analogy I like to use is a car. The private sector is like the engine. It makes the car go. I don't want the engine driving the car. The driver of the car is the democracy. The democracy decides where we go. The engine gets us there. So I'm not down on corporations at all, but I'm also not looking at them to save us and to write the rules on behalf of the American people, because that isn't their job and that isn't what they think about and that's not what they're doing. And I'll tell you a story which is what I believe in. Look, in World War II, we went and asked, FDR went and asked the big three auto companies what they were willing to do in terms of manufacturing the goods needed for us to catch up and protect ourselves. And they thought about it. They were Americans. They were patriots. They said 20%. And he said, here's the rule, 100%. We have to survive 100%. When we have to survive, the government gets to tell the private sector what they're going to do. And I'm sure those companies did fine in World War II. I'm not worried about them. The question was, you can't ask them to put aside their jobs, their responsibilities, and suddenly represent the American people. That's not the right people. The right people are the elected representatives of the people thinking only about the people. And that's where we are here, Greg. I'm not down on companies, but I'm not expecting them to take over responsibility from us, government of, by, and for the people. Of, by, and for the people.
And speaking of people, I hear questions a lot, what can I do? And I think people who know about climate, how big it is, feel overwhelmed. They think individual action is meaningless. Other people think that, well, if we all do one thing, then that adds up. Other people say, well, individual action is illusion, because look, we're not going to save this by going vegan and electric, right? So what's your view on the efficacy of individual action?
Well, first of all, I do think people have a responsibility to try and behave well as human beings, as citizens. But for us to succeed here, we need structural change. My story about GM and Ford and Chrysler, to me, we need structural change, and there's no question about it. We need to change the rules of society. And I would say this, and I've said this to my friends in the climate movement. I have a strategy to win on climate that people can do. It's called taking over the biggest government in the world. That's my strategy, and making it work to solve this problem.
This is Climate One. I'm Greg Dalton, and my guest is Tom Steyer, businessman and activist running for the Democratic presidential nomination. Our lightning round and audience questions are up next when Climate One continues. Just a friendly reminder for you in the room to pass your cards if you haven't already done so. Then they'll come. Steve needs to get on that right now. Keep that circulating. Thanks. My guest on Climate One is Tom Steyer, Democratic candidate for president. We're talking about his position on climate, immigration, healthcare, and more. Now for our lightning round. So, Tom, I have some...
If you guys have suggestions on how to answer these, please shout them out. I'm not shy.
Lifeline. I'm going to mention a noun, and you're going to mention the first thing that comes to your mind and pretend that your listeners, your handlers, your messengers, and others are not listening. What's the first thing, Tom Steyer, that comes to mind when I say liberal paper straws?
Liberal paper straws?
Donald Trump is printing plastic straws. He thinks that paper straws are a little, never mind.
Nothing.
You saw that tweet. What's the first thing that comes to mind when I say fried food on a stick?
Iowa State Fair.
Moscow Mitch.
What comes to mind is Moscow Mitch McTreason.
Speaker Pelosi.
My representative.
The Squad.
The new leadership in the Democratic Party.
Charles Koch.
A man who's done inestimable harm to the United States and the world.
Jury duty.
A citizen's duty.
Term limits.
A good idea.
This is true or false. True or false, Tom Steyer. Democrats are all walking around like Eeyore.
I think that's an exaggeration, Greg.
Emily's List leader Stephanie Shrirock said that recently. True or false, Tom Steyer. Elizabeth Warren had the best summer performance of any Democratic candidate.
She had a very good one.
True or false, American taxpayers can afford to defend every oceanfront community threatened by rising
Can
sea.
afford to?
Can afford.
False.
True or false, blending corn ethanol and gasoline is a poor way to reduce carbon pollution.
I think it can be an effective way.
An effective way.
Effective.
True or false, your hedge fund invested in Canadian tar sands, coal, and other dirty energy.
Yes. And I changed and divested from it.
True or false, addressing the climate reality will cause discomfort for the donor class that supports environmental causes and political campaigns.
I don't think so.
True or false, windmills cause cancer.
Yes, Mr. Trump is not a scientist.
True or false, one weakness of your campaign is connecting with African American voters.
False.
True or false, you're willing to take a stand against your union friends when they support building oil and gas pipelines and other fossil fuel infrastructure that will further destabilize the climate.
I am willing to oppose those things and to talk to the unions who would otherwise have jobs doing them.
True or false, you will wear your one and only plaid tie for the presidential debate.
I own more than one.
True or false, if you win, your kids will get richer selling access to you and your business interests.
Whoever wrote that question doesn't know my kids. Three of them are sitting in the front row, and that's not how they're built.
Let's give them a round for getting through the lightning round. So on climate, do you think that we need to deploy the technology we have now, or is new innovation required?
We can get by on the incremental, progressive technology change that you can see from existing technologies. But we also know there will be technological breakthroughs. So when we think about whether we can solve this problem, we know we can solve this problem. We have to aggressively do it. And I also believe if you look at the history of the United States and the world, we're smart. There are millions of smart people in this country. We are going to solve this problem. Our technology is going to be a huge part of this. We have to trust the technology and go with it and know that it's going to make us richer, better employed, and we're going to create millions of net union jobs out of this.
But those transitions can be messy, with wealth created and wealth destroyed. There are some parts of the economy, and you address this in your plan, where there will be job and wealth dislocation and wealth destruction. We've seen coal companies go bankrupt a lot already in this country. So what are you willing to do to help the people that are dislocated
Right.
out of the coal economy while this wealth is being created somewhere else by a new tech job? There's an auto worker put out of work in Ohio, but some new tech person has a job in San Francisco making autonomous vehicles.
So let me say this. We have put in our plan $50 billion aside to hold harmless people working in the industries that are going to decline as this transformation happens. Because there's no reason that they should be blamed for taking jobs in industries that weren't going to grow. And in particular, if you go to West Virginia and talk to the people who work in coal mines, or talk to the people who live there, they know that in taking that job, they're effectively shortening their lives. And they're willing to do it because they'd like to provide a decent lifestyle for their families. So why would you ever feel that it's appropriate to punish those people or to solve this problem on their backs? And that's why we set the money aside. And we also said, we've set the money aside, but we want to go to those communities to ask them how they think we should make this transition, what we can use this money for best. Because traditionally what people have done is come up with training programs to jobs that don't exist. And so in this case, let's be realistic about what we should do from a responsibility standpoint. But our goal in this whole plan is to go to the communities and learn from them their needs, as opposed to show up and tell them what they need.
When President Obama went about reforming healthcare, he went to some large industries, particularly the insurance industry, and said, there is going to be some change, but there's a place for you in this new policy construct. What would you do regarding fossil fuel companies to say, what is their role in a clean energy economy? Would you try to get them on board, or would you have them just 100% against you?
Look, I think there are two things that have to happen with fossil fuel companies. One is they have to start to think of themselves as energy companies, not fossil fuel companies. But I think that there's a big change that's going to happen that's absolutely important to happen, which is we start to understand what an oil company or a natural gas company really is. Because there's a sense on Wall Street that these are continuing businesses with revenues and margins and growth that are continuous into the future. And if you think about what a fossil fuel development company does, they buy a field, they develop the field, they produce energy from the field. They basically liquidate the field, take the money and buy another field. It's only a continuing business as long as there are going to be more and more fields. And there aren't. So at some point, they're going to have to come to the conclusion that in fact, they're either a liquidation or they're going to take the money and invest in clean energy. And there's no two ways about this. We are not in a position, as they say, if something can't go on forever, at some point it has to stop. Yeah, at some point it's got to stop. And at some point the people on Wall Street have got to come to the conclusion that their model, that the computer program that they live in, that they believe is the real world, does not equate to the real world. It's going to be and I've been saying this to them for 10 years, and they've been kind of politely ignoring me or impolitely ignoring me. But I'm telling you, if you think about the mortgage crisis, what happened in the mortgage crisis? They had a model, and they thought the model was the world. And when the model wasn't the world, everything went wrong. They have a model for oil companies that they think is the world, and it's not the world. And they've got to come to the conclusion as soon as possible that what they're talking about continuing forever, is not going to happen. And they need to use a different model and come to the real world. And we're going to have to, and I'm going to try and get them to do this as soon as possible, because that is an important change in the way the world's going to be financed and an important change in terms of making the transition.
Another huge industry around the country is property development, and there's still lots of waterfront property being developed. Banks are issuing loans, insurance companies are issuing policies. I've interviewed the mayor of Miami here on this stage. It comes out of property development. They're still building waterfront condos in Miami, knowing that those are very risky, castles in the sand. What would you do speaking truth to property and some people who say, wait, my house flooded, I want the government to bail me out?
Well, I think it was in 2014, and I was in Miami in an office building looking down on Biscayne Bay, and I was talking to the environmental community, so that's probably an exaggeration, but a bunch of environmentally sensitive people from Miami. And I was saying, your town is built on limestone, the seas are rising, everything that Greg just said, oh, this looks bad. And first of all, they hadn't been talking about it, which really, really, really surprised me. But I guess it's something it's a little scary to talk about. But the guy, one of the state officials who is in charge of one of the big environmental areas in Florida, turns to me and he looked alarmed and he goes, "Do you think I should sell my house?" And I was like, that's not the responsible answer for someone who's in charge of a big part of the environment in Florida. So I think that there's an if you build on a floodplain next to the Mississippi, it's going to flood. If you look at the projections about sea rise, it's going to rise. The question is how much? Miami's exactly at sea level. It's built on limestone, so you can't build a wall. It comes up through the streets. And so, we're in the real world here. Cities that are built at sea level around the world, of which tons of the biggest cities in the world are, including San Francisco, California, just to choose one, are at risk. And so the cost of taking care of that risk is many, many, many multiples the cost of avoiding that risk. And so for everybody who's sitting here trying to act in the short run and ignore what's happening, just be aware. The costs of ignoring the truth are incredibly high, and we're just talking about money. We're not talking about the enormous amount of human suffering that will cause.
And a lot of the people who can flee will, and some of the people who can't afford to leave will get stuck. And there's some real moral questions there about efficacy. And we're going to go to our audience questions, and the people who are going to come, if your name is called by Sarah Catherine, please go to the microphone in the back and read the question that you wrote down for us.
So we're going to invite up Jeff C., Ben Murphy, Lauren Schwartz, Liz C., and James Driscoll. If I called your name, would you mind coming back here?
Come back to the microphone. And
that's Ben Murphy, Jeff C., Lauren Schwartz, Liz C., and James Driscoll.
Fabulous. This is our way of... Okay, if you're just joining us, I'm talking with Tom Steyer at Climate One, Democratic presidential candidate. Let's go to our audience questions. Welcome to Climate One.
Hi, I'm Ben. The 2020 Democratic nominee has a challenge not only in winning the White House, but also in taking back control of the Senate. What do you, if you are the nominee, bring to down-ticket races in Iowa, Maine, Texas, Colorado, etc.?
So that's obviously a great question, and it points out the fact that Democrats need to have a sweeping victory, not eke out a victory. Job one is to beat Mr. Trump, absolutely. But if all we do is job one, we're in a terrible position. So we need a gigantic, sweeping victory. There are two things it's going to take. One is a positive vision for the United States. I believe Mr. Trump was elected because people realized we had a broken government, but no one was giving a vision for how we get back our government. I think it's important for people to realize that we can break this corporate stranglehold on our government. We can take back the government. And if we do so, we're going to have a lifestyle, assuming we solve the climate issue, we're going to have a lifestyle for Americans that's better than anyone understands. Better than anyone understands. We're going to have healthcare as a right, free public education from pre-K through college with training, living wage, clean air and clean water as a right for every single living American. So what is it going to take? One is a positive vision that people accept and rally around about how we get back the democracy, and the other is grassroots. And so, just so you know, Ben, for the last 10 years, I've been organizing Americans at the grassroots, and I've promised that regardless of what happens to my candidacy, I will keep doing that organization on college campuses. We've knocked on tens of millions of doors with our partners in the labor movement. We will keep doing every single grassroots thing that I believe is going to change the turnout, which changed the turnout in 2018. And I believe the key for a sweep is actually showing up. Being registered, caring, and showing up. And if we do that, we will win a very broad generational victory with a different vision for America, which is exactly what we need to do.
Hi, I'm Lauren Schwartz. So I agree with everything you say, as most of us here do. But my question is that it seems to me that there are many other Democratic candidates who also agree with you. They agree with you on climate and how important it is in the Green New Deal. They agree with you on corporations taking over our democracy. And so my question for you, especially since you had said you weren't going to enter the race, why are you better than those others? How are you different from the others? And would your energy and money be better spent helping those others get to win the election and or funding other concerns that you've been funding all along?
So one thing you should know is I've guaranteed that I will keep doing all the grassroots organizing that we've done and that we would otherwise do. So it's not an either or, it's both. Second thing I'd say is this. You talked about being the same as other people. I'm completely different from everyone else on climate. Completely different in my mind. There is no one else who's talking about actually taking steps on day one to declare a state of emergency. I consider that to be entirely different, and I believe that we can't build an international coalition unless we do it, nor in fact can we act in time to solve this problem. I think, how am I different from other people generically? I believe I'm an outsider. I believe I'm the person who's for 10 years been working in the political system as an outsider and had success beating corporations time and again. I think that if you look at the leading people in the polls, they're all senators or former senators. So you have to ask yourself, if you think the problem is a broken government, do you think the solution is going to come from inside the Beltway? Or do you think the solution is going to come from the grassroots and from somebody who's been doing it for 10 years from the outside? And the last thing I'd say is this. Mr. Trump is going to run on the economy. He's going to say everything about climate is a socialist plot. I listened today on NPR to Mike Pence say, I can pretty much quote him because it was so annoying. And this is pretty darn close to verbatim. I can honestly say that if any of the Democratic candidates are elected, they will undo all the progress that we've had in the economy over the last 2.5 years. It's almost a direct quote. That's what they're going to run on. I spent 30 years studying how companies are successful, how industries are successful, how communities are successful, and how countries are successful in terms of prosperity and growth. If Mr. Trump wants to talk about the economy, he's a fake, he's a failure in business, and everything he's done as far as I'm concerned about economics is wrong. I'd love to take him on, and I know much more about this, in my opinion, than anybody else. I'd love that. That's my idea of heaven.
Okay. Tom,
Step up to the microphone, please.
Yep. Can you hear me? Okay. Jeff Cox. Tom, I appreciate you being here tonight. I understand you're an expert on climate, but I would appreciate some clarity as to exactly what climate actions you would implement on day one.
So if you look at what we can do the things that are symbolic, like rejoining Paris, but we can also start to put in regulations that have to do with building codes. If you look at what's worked in California, actually regulations have been really important. Building codes, starting in the 1970s, we've led the world, and it's incredibly important. If you look at, in California, the #1 source of greenhouse gases at this point is transportation. So we can start immediately on the idea of insisting about where we're going in transportation in terms of electric vehicles and miles per gallon. We can do that immediately. We can start to move money around to have the impact. The government can buy differently. The government is a huge purchaser of goods and services. We can change that and do that through a climate lens. We can change the way we allow the use of public lands. We can do an enormous number of things immediately that will have huge ramifications, and that absolutely can be done under the emergency powers of the president, and I would do them.
Next question, welcome.
Hi, I'm James Driscoll, and I know that great policy is powerless without support. So how will you revolutionize American culture in order to revolutionize American environmental policy? In other words, I'm not interested in how you're going to defeat Trump. How do you defeat cynicism?
I agree. We actually have this great opportunity together. The way that actually America changes is for people to decide to change. And that's to have a conversation, but to put out and discuss what it is we're trying to do, and if the people accept it, so that in fact the election becomes a mandate for change and everyone understands what that change is supposed to be. If you think about 2008, we started having conversation about healthcare in 2006. And if you remember that campaign, there was so much conversation about healthcare. Everybody knew that if the Democrat won, there was going to be an intense attempt to pass some kind of comprehensive health legislation. So when you ask about how change happens and how we would beat cynicism, by talking about what we need to do and having people discuss it and understand it and come to a common understanding. And let me say this. In 2018, the organization I founded, Next Gen America, did the largest youth voter mobilization in American history. Young people, people under 30 in the districts we were working in 2014 voted less than 20%, less than 1 in 5 Americans under 30 voted at all. We asked hundreds of thousands of young people, why you don't vote? Like, that's a conversation opener for us with every single person we talk to. And they would say, no one tells the truth. No one deals with our issue. There's no difference between the parties. Why would I vote? The system's broken. So to me, the question here, and we managed to take in the districts we're in, the young people's vote, the people under 30, from 18% to 41%, more than a double. And so, to me, the way that we can get a sweeping victory is to beat cynicism, is to say to people, this is incredibly important. Your participation is incredibly important. You have to show up for your own sake and for everyone you love and for everything that you love. That is what this is going to be about. And if people believe that in fact we will revive what it means to be an American, we will succeed, we will accomplish this, then they will show up. And that is the whole plan of this election. If we don't do that and we re-elect this corrupt, dangerous president, we are in a ton of trouble. But I believe that the American people have been waiting for a long time for a new positive vision of what we're trying to accomplish.
Welcome.
Hi there, Lizette Chapman. What you said just now really resonated in that you need people to show up, you need them to get involved. That was one of the things that triggered so many people to support Trump, and that a lot of Democrats lost out on because Trump was the only one talking about the economy and jobs. So my question to you, going back to an earlier metaphor that you used about the corporations being the engine and the government being the driver, how are we going to get more jobs for the coal miners and for the long haul truckers and for the retail workers who chose not a great career for longevity? Like, how are you going to do that for all of these people that are motivated, whose vote counts every bit as much as everyone else here? How are you going to win?
So let's talk for a second about the American economy and jobs. Just to be clear, we have 3.7% unemployment in the United States of America. When I was growing up and when I was going to college taking econ courses, 4% unemployment was considered full employment, and everything beyond that. That's how much employment you have. It's called frictional unemployment. People who are changing jobs because they wanted to change jobs or they were moving or whatever. We have a lot of jobs in this society. We don't have a lot of jobs in this society that you can afford to live on. We have a wage problem in this society. The reason people are so concerned about coal mining jobs and driving jobs is because they're well-paid jobs. You know, those are jobs in industries that people fought literally to unionize, fought to get fair wages. The coal companies, they're talking about their great wages. Go back in history and look why coal miners have decent wages. They went and had pitched battles with the people who ran those coal mines. Those coal mine owners are famous for taking advantage of their workers. drivers. That's the Teamsters. That is a union that worked for decades to get fair wages and benefits. So when we think about what we're doing in the United States, the question we have is, why do people not get fair wages in most jobs in the United States? Why do people in California have to take a couple of jobs to support their family and to live anywhere near where they work? The real issue we have in the United States is not do we have a big enough pie? We have a big enough pie. We're the richest country in the history of the world. The question we have is how we're splitting up the pie. Why is it that for 40 years, 80% of America hasn't gotten a raise? Our issue is, look, we're talking about rebuilding the United States of America in a sustainable fashion. We're talking about millions of jobs. Our question is, are those jobs going to pay a living wage? Can people afford rent and health care? We're in a place where the real question here is, are people earning enough to pay the rent? Are people earning enough to be able to afford health care? Not do we have enough jobs. If we do what we have to do on climate, think about what that means to rebuild the United States of America. That means rebuilding the grid. That means redoing every building in the United States. That's a lot of electricians. That's a lot of construction workers. So let's talk about fair wages and controlling healthcare costs so that people in the United States can live a decent life and can afford, we're living in San Francisco, California, to afford to live within an hour of their work.
After I wrap up the radio program, Tom's going to dash out. Don't worry, he's going to come back. He's going to go downstairs and talk to some local media and will join us in the reception out there. We invite you to join us in the lounge for a reception afterwards, and also invite you to join our Let's Talk Climate campaign. Our goal here is to get people talking about climate. Tom did a video for this one time last time he was here, so tweet this, talk about it, and share that on your social media. I'd like to thank the Climate One crew. I have the pleasure and honor of sitting up here with Tom and other luminaries, but it's really the Climate One crew who makes this happen. Let's give them a round of applause for I'm Greg Dalton, and my guest today was Democratic activist and businessman Tom Steyer, who's running for president. Podcasts of this and other Climate One shows are available wherever you podcast. Please help us get more people talking about climate by giving us a rating or review. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time, everybody. That was great. Thank you. Great. We'll get you down.
I think the DMC...
See you back.
Thank you.